Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
Poet Crystal Wilkinson says people are always surprised to hear that there are Black people in Appalachia. That's despite the fact that 2 million Black people live in the region. And the Black presence in Appalachia goes all the way back to the time of enslavement. Crystal's own family is part of that history. Her relatives Aggie and Tarleton Wilkinson were an interracial couple in the early 1800s. Crystal talks about all of that in her new book, Praise Song for the Kitchen Ghost, stories and recipes from 5 generations of Black country cooks. It's a culinary memoir about how she connects with her Appalachian ancestors through food. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Today we're airing an extended interview with Crystal Wilkinson. She talks about her family, food, and growing up in Appalachia. Crystal is a writer and former poet laureate of Kentucky. She also teaches creative writing at the University of Kentucky, and her previous books include Perfect Black. Crystal, it's wonderful to have you on Disrupted.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
Before we talk about the book and your work, I am always curious about how a creative like you decides to tell this story that is so deeply personal. What is it about this connection to Kentucky for you, given your family origins, that compelled you to write this culinary memoir?
Well, I think when I've written poetry and fiction, food is character and place for me. So I'd never, when people started interviewing me or writing papers about my work, I started to see all of these things around food. And I was like, do I write about food that much? I didn't even realize it because it's just part of my culture for me. And so I started thinking about it, and I thought about it for a really long time and wanted to tell the story of my family for a long time. And I think that food was this great conduit to the ancestors in thinking about how long certain dishes had been cooked and what were their origins and that sort of thing. So that's where it came from.
Being able to tell that story, to tell a story not just of food, but of connection and of reverence and a multi-generational aspect. You write that 5 generations of your family have lived in a little hamlet called Indian Creek. Describe Indian Creek for our listeners.
Indian Creek is a very rural place, sort of a hidden place. When I went to college and people used to say, where are you from? That's for many of us, and I think particularly for Black Appalachians, that whole thing of like, where are you from, is huge. And so the way I would describe it is that it's off the beaten path. Like you have to know that you're going there. It is now with technology, but when I was growing up, it wasn't even on the map. So it's off the main road. And then it's paved now, but it used to be a little gravel road. And we actually used to have to drive through the creek to get up to my grandparents' house. There's a little bridge there now, but our house sat on a hill in that little haven, which was a heaven kind of place, surrounded by 64 acres of my grandfather's land and a rolling creek in between. Closest neighbors, probably a mile and a half on each side.
I feel like I'm there with you. There's a smile that is creeping across your face as you describe that memory. And it reminds me, Crystal, a lot of this place that I grew up in Virginia, where it was a big deal when you went from a dirt road to a paved road.
Yes.
It was this sign of progress, but also a different kind of connection. You start the dedication of this book, Praise Song for the Kitchen Ghost, by raising the names of Christine and Silas Wilkinson. Who are these amazing people?
Those are my grandparents. When I was born, my mother suffered from mental illness. She had been diagnosed as being a paranoid schizophrenic. And so My grandparents came to Ohio to get us when I was 6 weeks old. And my mother subsequently moved to Lexington, and I was raised there with my grandparents. And oh wow, they were though I still miss them all these years later. Such wise um, people. My grandfather was a primarily a tobacco farmer, but also raised pigs and cows and made sorghum. My grandmother was a domestic worker who I like to say kept us fed, like, in the belly and in the heart and spirit and mind. She was the one that was full of wisdom and always keeping us fed.
It sounds like she helped keep you fed, but also grounded and
Oh, yes.
connected in those ways. You also mention in that dedication, and I want to raise this quote, exact words, to Grandma Aggie, born in 1795, who always answers when I call. What have those
Mhm.
calls been throughout your life to Grandma Aggie?
Well, it was almost sort of a literal, like I was supposed to be writing something else, as writers always are, when I found her. And she had been mentioned. I have a couple of cousins who have done our genealogy, and she had been mentioned. But when I found her for myself in the archives, and when I was supposed to be writing something else, and I was at a writing retreat in Florida, and she sort of began to haunt me in a very almost literal way. I was there in this very hot place with a mosquito net around my bed, and um, I woke up dreaming about her. And she said, "My mother is calling my name, but not in your language." And I sort of bolted out of the bed and ran out of my cabin and walked the beach. And I could just hear that so plainly. And I kept thinking, well, what does this mean? Is this a short story? Is this a poem? Where is she coming from? Is this a real? Am I like channeling my ancestor? Like, what's going on? And so as I settled into that, I like to think that through the tools that are available to me through spirit and the tools that are available to me as a fiction writer, that she was there. Like, she sort of rose up, and I began to think about her life and research her life and imagine and reimagine her life and what it was like.
Often think in pop culture, the term ghost has this very ominous, sort of evil approach. But for many Black folks, the ghosts are the ancestors, the spirit, the
Mhm.
connection that come to protect you, come to guide you, and also remind you. When you use the phrase, the kitchen ghost, what does that mean for you?
That's exactly what it means. It's the ancestors. It's that sort of African concept of Sankofa, of always sort of reaching back to know how you move forward. It's taking these bits and pieces of her that I can find. She and tens of thousands of Black women like her are not documented except for in these very sparing ways. I think I'm lucky in that she's documented probably more than most because of her connection to my third great grandfather, who was white. And so, as far as like deeds and land transfers and things like that, I can find her in these records, which was overwhelming and very emotional for me. But she definitely serves as a stand-in for all of our ancestors in some way. You're talking about being from Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, all of these sort of places, and sort of the differences between geographically those places and historically from what we often think about as enslavement in the Deep South.
Let's talk a little bit about some of those differences because there are such parallels in your family history and the story that you are telling in this memoir to many other people. But there is something particularly unique about the area that you grew up in. And I think often the histories, the experiences, the present experiences of Black people in Appalachia go overlooked or ignored or sort of just thrown into the mix of Black people in the South? What is it about the uniqueness of Black people in that particular region that you bring to bear in your work to really challenge our understanding of what Black life feels like in that area?
Well, I mean, I think, one thing that I'll say is that I hope that my book, especially at this time in our country, that it enters the conversation about where is Appalachia, what is Appalachia, who lives there, who has agency there, who doesn't have agency there, and those kind of conversations that are going on nationally. And of course, this book was written long before that. I lived this experience. My ancestor lived this experience long before that. So I think that the presence of Black people in Appalachia has gone unnoticed. And I think that people have a tendency to make Appalachia a scapegoat. So if Appalachia is a scapegoat, you want to keep it white, you want to keep it poor, you want to keep like one particular view, and it's much more complex than that. So I think the African American presence in Appalachia, which has almost always been there from the very beginning, adds a complexity. So it begins to skew your view if you have a stereotypical view of the region. And the Black presence, I think, in Appalachia sits alongside the white presence. Because one thing that was a big unifier was the land itself. If it's midwinter in Appalachia and there is no food to grow, because unlike the Deep South, you can't go out and plant a winter garden. You have to do a lot of preservation. So a lot of that preservation was being done with the Black families alongside the white families. They would get together and can, or they'd get together at hog killing time and separate the bounty so that everyone could eat. And so I think those are some. And religion, I can't say that I'm necessarily a religious person now, but that sort of grounding in spirituality was always there at the center, because the church, when you're in an isolated place like that, the church serves as a center of community.
Yeah. We had Leah Penniman on the show, and she talked about Black people reclaiming their connection to land, of having this reverence, this connection of spirit, and how place also becomes a reminder of, as you said, the sense of agency that people have when others are trying so hard to erase their presence or to undermine their presence, how Black communities have used land to leverage that. I'm curious, Crystal, given all of the things that you do, what is it about literature that is this powerful vehicle for telling these stories of your family, of generations of families, of communities that often get overlooked and erased in this place that you often refer to as Afralachia? To remember, we've been here and we will continue. How does literature become a vehicle to do that?
Well, I think the arts are, overall are the vehicles to do that. That's how we remember. That's how we raise storytelling up from myth to reality. That's how we remember and re-remember history. It was important for me to allow my ancestors, not for me just to talk about them, but again, to use the tools that are available to me as a poet and as a fiction writer to allow the story. Here's a woman born in 1795 as an enslaved child, is basically enslaved in her common law marriage. I think that Grandma Aggie probably, maybe in her home somewhat, but in that world that she lived in, she didn't have agency. So what better way to give her agency? And by giving her agency, giving agency to tens of thousands of other Black women that allow her to step forth and tell her own story. And that's what I do over and over again. I got obsessed with that. And probably if it hadn't been for Frances, my editor, I probably would have written it entirely in her voice, because that's how strong her voice was. And even the voice of my grandmother, like these were women that you don't really hear from. And to put the story on their tongue via literature, I think empowers them, and it also gives a clear vision to the reader.
You are a writer, but I also feel like you are a painter and an illustrator. So that listening to you, reading your work, we feel like we are in those kitchens. We feel like we are in those homes, connected to the land in the way that you help us understand all of the layers of that. There's a passage in the introduction to your book that captures this why and this connection. And I wondered if you would read that portion for us.
Sure. I am the keeper of the stories, the writer, the one who has carried the stories in my apron for so many years, the one who considers a rusty metal recipe box my finest family heirloom. I'm the one who makes a pot of chicken and dumplings and cornbread, who conjures up the kitchen ghost of my rural homeland every time I cook.
Coming up, more with poet Crystal Wilkinson. She'll tell us what surprised her in her family research.
To actually see where my third great grandfather, whose blood runs through my veins, actually owned people.
This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about Appalachia, food, and family history with former poet laureate of Kentucky, Crystal Wilkinson. Her latest book is Praise Song for the Kitchen Ghost, stories and recipes from 5 generations of Black country cooks. Before the break, Crystal read a passage from that book that started with this line: I am the keeper of the stories. To me, that meant that Crystal is responsible for the way her family's stories are told and shared. I asked her about the weight and power of being the keeper of those stories.
Well, I think there's a responsibility, like you said, using that word responsibility, but it's also an honor, I think. It's an honor to bring forth these sort of hidden figures, this hidden history, and all of the people that are connected to it. I mean, I think, especially during the period of enslavement and beyond, manumissions, we all know the history, but it's not often embodied. Even when it's embodied and we watch a film, or like we all watched Roots. That was like the first, I think, as when I was younger, that was the first sort of embodiment of like, oh my gosh, like there it is, like we're seeing it on the screen. But just like we are complex, and the story's not one-eyed, I think as many stories as we tell, like not just telling it in sort of a rote way, but like trying to make it tangible and physical and bring it to life and up to the surface so that people can see the complexity of it all. Like, when I've traveled around the country, so many people are so surprised about Grandma Aggie and Grandpa Tarleton's relationship. And since I've written the book, I have unearthed more about how complicated that was and how they sort of got by with being common law husband and wife during that time period. And they really didn't. They were called into court. I didn't know that information before, but they were called into court several times because he did not indenture his children. And he had to go to court several times. And the court wanted to know why these mulatto kids weren't on record as being slaves. And I mean, they went to court 3 times about that. So that kind of like nuanced belief lets us know that in its horror, that enslavement was complicated, that it wasn't all one way, and it wasn't all. It was still punitive. Don't get me wrong. It certainly was punitive in its nature, but it was also much more complex. And it was really complex, I think, in Appalachia. When I look at a lot of it, there were just many, many, not plantations, but many farms and mining areas and small inns that, of course, practiced enslavement, but they would only have 1 or 2 enslaved people there. And so by having those small numbers, then if you're human, your relationships are more complex. And so that's a big part of it too. And I think that's a big part of a sort of something that's not still, even with my book, hasn't been completely unpacked, how those relationships worked, and how they were differently compared to deep Southern plantations.
One of the fears or concerns that I have in this era where people are discouraged from learning history, when educators are discouraged from teaching history in all its fullness, all its complexity and nuance, as you just mentioned, is that we lose sight of the people who lived during that time, of the complex choices that they had to make, the ways that they imagine and reimagine community and family and connection, when we just paint this broad stroke of overlooking what Black communities, the kinds of choices that were there, and not just choices they made, but choices that were made about them. Were there other things that as you were writing this book that you discovered about your family that surprised you, or things that you've learned since that were surprising?
Yeah, there's been lots of things that were surprising. Like I said, all of those records that I found have been really surprising. I think it's also been surprising how my particular family has reacted. Like most people in my family have been really excited about the book, but a couple of people were concerned about the recipes. Like, oh, you're giving family recipes away, and that's been kind of amusing to me. Like it's been really something that we've all talked about, and that's been surprising. And I think when I was doing the research, I keep saying the same thing over and over, but that was one of the things that was so surprising to me is like, we think about that historical time, sort of a blanket, like, oh yes, we know this, we know the atrocities, but to then just be able to put your finger, like I actually had physical documents that had both of those particular ancestors' names on them, that I could touch the actual documents. I felt as if I shouldn't be touching them, that I should have gloves on, but to actually touch them. And it changed something in me. It sort of turned something over. It's like holding something up that you've always seen and then turning it around and you go, oh, I've never seen that side before. And that happened over and over with a variety of things, to actually see where my third great grandfather, whose blood runs through my veins, actually owned people and actually gifted people, gifted a baby to someone else in his family, a Black child who was enslaved. and to have walked around and been so proud of this Wilkinson name, and to know that that ancestor who came from England, that white ancestor, did those things. And my Black ancestor, like, I can't go any further than Virginia to find Aggie. Like, I can't go all the way back to Africa to find her. So those were some of the things that still sort of haunt me. I don't know if I'll write about them in the future, but they do still haunt me.
I'm listening to you recount that and thinking of my own family. There's a street, used to be a road, then it got paved and it got a stoplight. There's a street where on the left side is the Pendleton family who lives as white. On the other side is the Pendleton family who lives as Black, which is my side of the family. And all those ways that learning about your history, learning about that complexity pulls at something in your spirit, that sort of nagging of what does this mean to carry this name, knowing how it privileged some people and condemned others, but also how in telling your family history, you talk about the sacred nature of family recipes. It sort of forces others, right, to confront that. You paint this story of what home looked like, what it felt like for you. I'm curious what it smelled like for you. You talk about this chicken and dumplings recipe that I am going to try to recreate. What did it smell like for you to have all of this warmth and food together?
Well, I mean, I think it smelled wonderful, right? Like it was then and now. I think you're talking about memory, like so much of our memory is connected to the senses. And so it becomes a time travel, an act in time travel to cook a recipe that my grandmother cooked. And so to have that kind of food prepared in such a small place, like food permeated our entire lives. That's what you woke up with, like the smell of breakfast cooking. And what you went to sleep with was something that was being prepared for the next day. So you could tell by the various smells, like what time of day it was, and what time of year it was. And of course, the smells really changed during the preparation for holidays. Then you had all of these spices that came into play.
I don't know that I've ever thought about food as a marker of time and season, but it very much is. And these ways of orienting yourself as well. One of the things that I appreciate, of the many things I appreciate about this book, is that you are clear that there's a distinction between Appalachian food and Southern food overall, that we shouldn't just confuse these two. Tell me more about that distinction or that difference that's important to recognize, that nuance.
Well, I mean, I think, again, let's go back to the land. That's the primary difference. And the Appalachian way of doing things has to rely on preservation. Like you have to can, you have to prepare meats and put them in the smokehouse so that you can eat throughout the winter. And there's a special preparation in the spring where you go out and you forage, because unlike the Deep South where you can have like winter collards, you can't have winter collards in Appalachia. It's too cold. So come spring, my family has a tradition of foraging and finding those first natural greens, more for tradition now, but in the beginning it was for survival.
Yeah. And to think about survival in a very different way, right? In terms of what survival of spirit feels like, as well as the very basic physical survival.
Coming up, more with former Kentucky Poet Laureate Crystal Wilkinson. She'll talk about celebrating holidays like Thanksgiving while growing up in Appalachia.
I remember that being such a big deal to me as a girl, that I helped make this turkey and dressing, and I helped make these pies, and I helped make these rolls from scratch.
This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're hearing about Crystal Wilkinson's culinary connection with her Appalachian ancestors. She's a writer and former poet laureate of Kentucky. Her latest book is Praise Song for the Kitchen Ghost, stories and recipes from 5 generations of Black country cooks. It's a culinary memoir that delves into her family history and the connection that she feels to her ancestors when she cooks. In the book, Crystal talks about craving blackberries as an adult. But for her, that craving isn't just about the taste of blackberries. It's also a homesickness and a longing for the place she grew up. I asked Crystal to tell me more about that longing.
Yeah, every summer in July, my family would, my grandmother would put coal oil, which was kerosene, around our wrist and around our ankles, and tie strings around them so that the chiggers or other bugs couldn't get in. And then we would have our buckets. It would be so sweltering hot, and we'd have long sleeves and pants on and go out onto the graveyard, was where the largest bounty of blackberries were, an ancestral graveyard. And we would pick blackberries, fill our buckets, and take our bounty back home. Well, we'd eat much of it there, ants and all, whatever we were eating. It was just delicious. And then we would take it all back home. And usually there would be something that night. Granny would usually make a cobbler, but then the rest was saved for later. Like she would freeze some, or she would can some. And then that ritual of picking those blackberries took us on into the holidays, because by the time, I call it the harvest meal now, but by the time Thanksgiving came around or Christmas came around, she would request those jars of blackberries to make the jam that then became the jam cake. So that family gathering of blackberries, and the extended family would come in during blackberry season, and everybody would be out there with their winter clothes on to keep from getting bit by snakes. And it was just such a hard task to get those little succulent fruits. And then it carried us on into winter. And so you knew when she requested those canned jars from the cellar that it was time, that was a special time, because she didn't always do that. Even though she had them lined up, it was special to go get a jar of that summer bounty for the winter holidays.
I'm picturing you and lots of cousins with stained hands with this bounty of blackberries, and that sweetness and that joy of, this is something that we look forward to. This is something that we can do. And knowing that it will be this bridge into the holiday season. You write that you grew up in a very large, extended family. And I imagine in that area, it is blood family and the family that you connect, right? Because
Yes.
you're in that piece. What were holiday dinners like? You talked about some of those pieces. What were holiday dinners like as you think about that connection and lineage?
Oh, holidays were huge. Our house was very small, but my grandparents had 7 children, and so you take those 7 children and you attach their significant others, and then you multiply that, and so there was 25 grandchildren, 10 or 12 great-greats, and we all gathered in that small house. My grandmother would start And I would help her probably 3 days prior to a holiday. Sometimes, weeks prior, she might make the jam early for the jam cake. So there was the preparation part of getting it all together, and the sort of rise of excitement, like not just about the food, but about that this big crowd of people, like this big celebration is about to happen. And then the cooking of all of that, and helping, and staying up all night, which was almost, even during the harvest meal, it was almost like the same feeling that I would get as a child, like waking up on Christmas morning to open presents. It was that same feeling of excitement that the family's coming, and these special foods that we don't eat all year are going to be prepared. And my honor of helping prepare them, that was just, I remember that being such a big deal to me as a girl, that I helped make this turkey and dressing, and I helped make these pies, and I helped make these rolls from scratch. Nothing was bought. It was all made from scratch. And almost all of it was, the sweet potatoes were sweet potatoes that we had grown and that I had helped harvest. So there was that sort of continuation of joy that was, and a continuation of a celebration of the hard work that you'd done, which I also hearken back to enslavement. I was just talking to one of my colleagues about that yesterday, that one of the things that's missing, I think, in our academic Black lives is we're doing this hard work, but when are we going to do the singing and the dancing? And when's that going to come? Like, when do we do that part? And I think that that's what Thanksgiving always was. And then when everyone arrived, just the joy of the hugging, of seeing people you hadn't seen for a while, sometimes seeing people you saw yesterday, but everything had changed because it was the holiday. And the religious part of that, and lifting that up, and really celebrating the food, but also being grateful and having blessings over the food, because there was a real knowing the reality of not everyone had food. That was always a reminder of where we came from. That sort of looking back to times of scarcity versus times of plenty, and being grateful for that.
That gratitude, that sense of joy, functions as an act of resistance. That in this moment, in this space, we can create something beautiful together. I remember the tremendous pride I felt the first time my grandmother allowed me into her kitchen to help with the preparation. And, my back was a little straighter, and I held my head higher because it felt like a rite of passage that
Right.
Now I could be a part of that. I also remember, as you're telling this story, I keep thinking back the first time I walked into my grandparents' bathroom and saw this large ham soaking in the tub, because it meant we could have country ham for this holiday, and what that meant to bring community together. I'm curious, Crystal, how you talk about tradition, lineage, and connection to younger generations who often have a very different orientation to food or to family. How do you tell those stories so that they remember we've got to keep this going?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very mindful. I am. There's a certain, I guess, foundation of nostalgia. Even though I tried not to write this in a nostalgic way, I can't. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that I'm very much. It's almost a reverence of this time that I had with my grandmother, and looking back on it, and I do realize the times have changed, and I have to stand in what I remember and what I believe and what's nostalgic about this time, and also stand in that I am a woman of today, and my children are products of this modern modern time. And so as a feminist, I'm like, okay, of course they have their own agency. They can stand in the kitchen all day if they want to, but they don't have to. And that's part of the reckoning for myself in the book. Like, oh gosh, what if they don't carry this tradition forward that's been in the family for so long? But I think there's something to be, just like we talked earlier, there's something about returning to land and the land's propensity to heal. And I think that thinking about cooking not as a punitive act, women in the kitchen, not thinking of it as a punitive act, but as an act of meditation and an act of remembering and honoring the kitchen ghost. I think that has the ability to shift something in us where we don't see cooking as a punishment or something that's just relegated to women. My son is a good cook, and I've passed that along. And I hope that these next generations, one of the things one of my daughters said during the pandemic is when I realized that maybe they won't do this because we were doing everything by Zoom and they were cooking. And one of my girls said, we're going to go to a restaurant or something. I'm not doing all this. My feet are hurt. My back hurts. Is this what you do every year, Mom? And they were really taken aback by the amount of work that it takes. And what one of my girls said is, maybe I'll bring some of it forward. And I'm okay with that. If they just take a few of those tradition and a few of those dishes and bring them forward. I was working with some young people recently, and the question was asked, well, what, in the book, what would you suggest? And I thought about it, and I wanted to choose some of my favorite recipes and realized they're a little bit more complex, and maybe they couldn't do it. But I said, if a young person can make a pot of greens and they can make biscuits, they'll be all right. Like even in times of scarcity, if they have some flour and a few other ingredients, they could make some biscuits and have some bread. They could make a pot of greens and have some nourishment.
You have me thinking about some lessons I need to share with my own daughter, right? We've got to perfect that pot of green recipe. Let me ask you this really basic question, Crystal. Many of us have experienced throughout our lives this changing orientation, not just to food, but to the ingredients. I remember the first time I came home and told my family, I no longer eat pork, I no longer eat beef. And my grandmother said, what are you going to eat on Thanksgiving? Like, how are we going to feed you? And the first time she made a pot of greens that didn't include pork or a ham hock, it was this really revolutionary moment for our family. How does thinking about those changing notions of ingredients and all the dietary restrictions that people have, how does that show up for you as you're thinking about food and the connection and also the adjustment that can happen?
Well, it's been sort of circular for me because I spent about 20 years being a vegetarian and still honoring these traditions during those years. So yes, I know how to cook a good pot of meatless greens. I have done lots of substitutions for meat. The tofurkey did not go over very well that year. But we've had some Thanksgivings where there's been mostly, fixed turkey for the people who eat turkey, and then the sides is what it's all about anyway. The corn pudding, the greens, the dressing, and so there are ways to do that. And I think that innovation of those old family recipes are the way forward. Because, like people say, you've given me the courage after they've read the book, you've given me the courage to try, whatever it is. My grandmother's apple stack cake. I just never thought I could get it right. So I never even tried. And so my answer to that is you never will. Like when you think about, oh, I can't make it like my mother or my grandmother. Like, of course you can't. One, you're relying on memory that's steeped so deeply in nostalgia that you're never going to taste that same thing that you tasted when you were 10 years old. It's not going to be the same because your memory is back there in those decades ago. And it's not going to match up with whatever you try to cook because your kitchen ghost is no longer there to prepare it. And the second thing is that ingredients change. You know, whatever it is, something simple like vegetable shortening is healthier now than it used to be. It's not the same. Even if you were going to try to be authentic and go to the health food store and get lard that had been rendered in a sustainable way, in an organic way, it's not going to taste like the lard that your grandmother or great grandmother had because their hog was right over there in their hog pen on their same land in the same region. It didn't come from another part of the country or another part of the world. It was right there. And so those ingredients are not going to taste the same. So I think as we move forward, it's constantly about innovation. And, you know, asking the ancestors, inviting them in and being okay that you get as close as you can to the recipe. You're not going to be able to replicate it. It's just impossible. My grandmother, who was a brilliant cook, would say, I'd say, "Oh, Granny, this is so good." And she would say, "Oh, it don't taste like my mama's. I wish it tasted like my mama's."
This is the most beautifully affirming, reassuring, and liberating way of thinking about that taste and that love isn't a recipe that you can quantify, right? There's this social media trend of season until the ancestors tell you to stop, or they'll let you know a pinch of this. But the ways in which that nostalgia, that love, that comfort that we felt of being in those kitchens and allowing space for those kitchen ghosts to show up, whether we're ready for it or not, but inviting them into that space, that is a taste that I think we can all savor. And I appreciate you for reminding me of that. Crystal Wilkinson is a writer and former poet laureate of Kentucky. She teaches creative writing at the University of Kentucky, and her newest culinary memoir is called Praise Song for the Kitchen Ghost. Crystal, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, Meg Fitzgerald, and Meg Dalton. Our intern is Frankie DeVivo. Disrupted has more than 200 episodes highlighting changes and change makers. And with all those disruptions, you may not know where to start. So we made a playlist for new listeners and old friends to give you a sense of what this show is all about. You can find that playlist at ctpublic.org/disrupted. And you can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcasts. And you can listen to new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.